Hi, I'm Sophie Kivlehan. I want to tell you about your 16 tons. In 2015, the United States burned fossil fuels, that's coal, oil, and gas, containing 1,391 million tons of carbon. Burning oxidizes the carbon. The chemical reaction of carbon and oxygen produces CO2 plus energy. That's why we burn the fossil fuel. We want the energy that is given off when carbon and oxygen chemically combine. The atomic mass of carbon is 12 and oxygen is 16. So the mass of CO2, 12 plus 16, injected into the atmosphere is larger than the mass of carbon by the factor 12 plus 16 divided by 12, which is about 3.67. So the mass of CO2 injected into the air by the United States is 1,391 million tons of carbon times 3.67, which is 5,100 million tons of CO2. The population of the U.S. is about 320 million people, so that's 16 tons per person.
16 tons per person? That's exactly what Tennessee Ernie Ford was talking about.
Strong, you load 16 tons. What do you get? Another day older and deeper in debt. St. Peter, don't you call me, 'cause I can't go. I owe my soul to the company store.
And the fossil fuel, CO2, stays in the climate system for thousands of years, which creates the debt Tennessee Ernie is talking about. Because we now know, the scientific community now realizes that the amount of CO2 in the air is already causing climate change. And there is more climate change in the pipeline without increasing CO2 further. So if we burn still more fossil fuels, we must suck most of the additional CO2 back out of the air. Or young people will suffer major consequences, including eventual loss of most coastal cities.
It is possible to extract CO2 from the air by reforestation and by storing carbon in the soil. 2 years ago, my grandfather purchased 1 ton of biochar material. Biochar is charcoal made by pyrolysis of plants or organic waste. Plants suck CO2 from the air, and when they are heated to a high temperature in an oxygen-free environment, it produces charcoal.
This charcoal can be worked into the soil, where the carbon is in a form that is stable for hundreds or even thousands of years. Biochar is good for the soil. It adds nutrients, increases the water-holding capacity of the soil, makes the soil more productive. And clay soil of Pennsylvania needs it. Pennsylvania is not Iowa. So Sophie and I worked 1 ton of stuff into the soil around several newly planted trees, just outside the initial root zone, choosing those trees that were not doing very well. This worked well. In 2 years since, those trees have perked up relative to the others. But that 1 ton of stuff required 2 days of very hard work.
The 1 ton of stuff was half organic compost and half biochar, so a little bit less than a half of a ton of carbon. Times 44 over 12 makes it about 1.6 tons of CO2 that was taken out of the air and is now stored as char in the soil around those trees. It was a lot of work, yet the carbon we stored in the soil as biochar makes up for only 10% of the 16 tons of fossil fuel CO2 put into the air by 1 person in a year. I have 2 brothers, so with our mother and father, our family of 5 puts 80 tons of CO2 into the air each year if we are average Americans. So to make up for our 80 tons, we need to bury 50 times more than what we just buried around those trees.
And you need to do it every year. My 8-acre farm is not big enough for that. That picture is indicative of the global situation. We can store a lot of carbon in the biosphere and soil by means of reforestation and improved forestry and agricultural practices. But there's a practical limit on how much CO2 we can extract from the air in that way. So the upshot is that we need to rapidly phase down fossil fuel emissions, or it will become impossible to stabilize climate at a level that is fair to young people.
In our next video, we talk about how fast emissions must be phased down in order to stabilize climate, and whether it is practical to do that. It is still possible to stabilize climate, but our government is not taking the necessary actions to do that. That is why I am one of 21 young people who, together with my grandfather, have filed a lawsuit against the federal government, and we'll talk about that too. Thanks for watching.